Exposing this cat-girl spy will destroy my only partner.
You cannot escape this story. The link in the description is your only way forward.
How many lies can a man tell himself before the weight of them snaps his spine like a dry branch? I have spent 15 years hunting ghosts in the rain, convincing myself that every arrest made the world a little brighter, but tonight the shadows feel heavier than usual. The neon lights of the city reflect off the puddles in oily streaks of violet and crimson, painting the pavement in colors that feel far too vibrant for a man who lives in the gray. I am looking for a traitor, someone who has managed to peel back the layers of our national security as if they were nothing more than wet paper. The mission is supposed to be simple, a surgical strike to remove a cancer from the system, yet my hands are shaking in my pockets. I wonder if I am still the hunter, or if I have finally become the prey of my own conscience. Question hook. The Ministry of Defense has lost 3 terabytes of high-level encryption data in the last 48 hours, and every byte of it was hand-delivered to our enemies by a ghost. We call them ghosts because they leave no fingerprints, no heat signatures, and no digital breadcrumbs that lead back to a human face. The reality of counterintelligence is that we are not fighting armies. We are fighting people who know exactly which floorboards in our house are the loudest. I have been tasked with finding the source of this leak, and the trail has led me to the most unlikely corner of the city. If I fail, the defense grid falls within the week, and the silence that follows will be the sound of an entire nation being erased from the map. This isn't just a security breach. It is a countdown to total obsolescence. Shocking fact hook. I remember a night 3 weeks ago when the rain was just as cold as it is now. I sat in a diner with a woman who laughed at my terrible jokes and told me that the stars looked like spilled salt on a black tablecloth. We talked about everything except what we did for a living, creating a small, fragile bubble of normalcy in a life defined by deception. She reached across the table and touched my hand, her fingers warm and steady, and for a moment, I forgot that I carried a badge and a weapon. Now, as I stand in the dark watching the entrance of a club, I realize that every word we shared might have been a calculated move in a game I didn't know I was playing. The memory of her smile feels like a blade tucked between my ribs, sharp and persistent. Mini-story hook. Loyalty is a luxury for those who have never been forced to choose between their heart and their duty. In my line of work, we are taught that the mission comes before the individual, that the state is a living organism, and we are merely the white blood cells tasked with purging infection. But the state does not have a heartbeat, and it does not look at you with eyes that seem to hold the secrets of the universe. To be a patriot is to be a professional liar, a man who trades his soul for the safety of people who will never know his name. I have lived by that creed until tonight, but as the truth begins to unravel, I find that my allegiance is far more brittle than I ever imagined. Bold statement hook. I am tired of the masks, the aliases, and the constant feeling that someone is watching me from the periphery of my vision. There is a specific kind of loneliness that comes with knowing that if you died tonight, your handlers would simply burn your files and replace you with another body in a charcoal trench coat. I look at my reflection in a darkened shop window and barely recognize the man staring back at me. His eyes are too hollow, his jaw too tight, and his spirit seems to be fraying at the edges like an old coat. I just want to find one thing in this city that is real, even if that reality is the very thing that finally destroys me. Optional vulnerability hook. The rain slicked the collar of Tobias's trench coat as he leaned against the brickwork of a narrow alleyway. Across the street, the neon sign for the Velvet Paw flickered in a rhythmic stutter of pink and gold, casting long, distorted shadows across the wet asphalt. He checked his watch, the dial glowing faintly in the gloom, before a figure detached itself from the darkness near a row of industrial trash bins. Charles approached with his usual frantic energy, his eyes darting toward the street corners as he pulled a crumpled tablet from his inner pocket. The man looked like he hadn't slept in a week, his tie loosened and his skin sallow under the harsh glow of the street lamps. Without a word, Charles swiped a finger across the screen, bringing up a low-resolution image captured by a rooftop security camera near the Ministry of Information. The figure in the frame was draped in a heavy, dark cloak, their face obscured by a deep hood, but the way they moved suggested a predatory grace that no ordinary thief possessed. They were clutching a drive containing the latest batch of intercepted diplomatic cables, disappearing into the fog just as the silent alarms had been triggered. Charles leaned in close, his voice a gravelly whisper that barely carried over the sound of the downpour. "This is the third time this month, Tobias, and the encryption they are cracking is supposed to be unbreakable. Whoever this is, they aren't just a thief. They are a specialist with access to hardware we didn't even know existed." Tobias took the tablet, his thumb tracing the blurry outline of the hooded figure. The height was right, and the way the person held their shoulders felt hauntingly familiar, a realization that sent a cold shiver down his spine that had nothing to do with the weather. "Are you sure about the location?" Tobias asked, his voice steady despite the sudden pounding of his heart. Charles nodded firmly, pointing toward the jazz club. The signal from the drive flickered out right at the entrance of that building. "If they are in there, you have to move now before they dump the data onto a remote server." Tobias handed the tablet back, his jaw set in a hard line. "Go back to the van and keep the channel open. If I don't come out in an hour, signal the perimeter teams." Stepping into the club was like entering a different dimension where the air was thick with the scent of expensive tobacco and the smooth, honeyed notes of a saxophone. Tobias navigated the crowded floor, his eyes scanning the room for anything out of place while trying to maintain the appearance of a casual patron. On the small, circular stage at the center of the room, Kaya was performing. She moved with a fluid, hypnotic elegance that seemed to pull the very air toward her. Her sleeveless black silk dress shimmered under the spotlights, and her long evening gloves reached past her elbows, hiding the lethal strength he knew she possessed. Most of the men in the room were watching her with glazed eyes, captivated by the way her dark tail occasionally peeked from the hem of her dress to twitch in time with the music. To them, she was a beautiful curiosity, a feline-human hybrid who sang like an angel. To Tobias, she was the woman who had shared his tea and his secrets for months, and seeing her now felt like looking at a stranger through a distorted lens. As the final note of her song faded into the rafters, Kaya gave a modest bow and stepped off the stage, ignoring the calls for an encore. She made a direct line for the corner table where Tobias had seated himself, her amber eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made him want to look away. She sat down across from him, her movements silent and precise. Her tufted velvet ears, usually hidden by her dark hair, twitched slightly as she leaned forward. "You look like a man who has carried the weight of the world through a rainstorm, Tobias," she said, her voice a low purr that vibrated in his chest. She began to pour tea from a ceramic pot that had been waiting for them, the steam rising in delicate curls between them. He watched her hands, noting the meticulous way she handled the cups. "You always know when I am troubled, Kaya," he replied, reaching out to touch the rim of his cup but not drinking. "It is a quiet night for a man in your profession to be out at a club. Is work that slow, or did you just miss the music?" The emotional pull between them was a physical force, a tether that had been tightening with every meeting they shared in the quiet hours of the night. Tobias looked at her flawless features, the vertical pupils of her eyes reflecting the dim amber light of the table lamp, and felt a wave of guilt wash over him. He wanted to tell her about the mission, about the thief he was hunting, and the terrifying possibility that the trail led straight to her. He wanted to ask her where she went when the sun went down and why her gloves never came off. Instead, he forced a smile and spoke of trivialities, the lies tasting like ash in his mouth. "The music is the only thing that makes sense lately," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Everything else is just noise and shadows." Kaya reached across the table, her gloved hand covering his. Her touch was firm, and for a second he thought he felt the slight pressure of something sharp beneath the silk. "We all have our shadows, Tobias. Some of us just learn to dance in them better than others." The moment was shattered by the shrill, piercing wail of a security siren echoing from the street outside. The sound was followed by the heavy thud of boots on the pavement and the distant shouting of men in uniform. Tobias stood up instinctively, his hand moving toward the concealed holster beneath his trench coat. The alarm was coming from the regional data hub only 2 blocks away, the very place Charles had warned him about. He looked down at Kaya, who remained perfectly still, her expression unreadable. "I have to go," he said, the urgency of his duty finally overriding the hesitation in his heart. "It is a security breach nearby." Kaya stood as well, her tail coiling tightly around her waist as she watched him with a look that might have been regret or perhaps something far more calculated. "Be careful, Tobias," she warned, her voice devoid of its usual warmth. "The rain makes the ground slippery, and it is easy to lose your footing when you are running in the dark." He didn't answer, turning instead to sprint toward the exit, his mind racing faster than his feet as he realized the thief had moved while he was distracted by a pot of tea and a pair of amber eyes. The cold downpour intensified as Tobias burst through the heavy oak doors of the club, the neon signs above bleeding blurry streaks of crimson and violet onto the flooded pavement. He didn't head for the main road where the sirens were wailing. Instead, he pivoted toward the narrow mouth of a service corridor where the gravel was churned and fresh. His boots splashed through deep puddles, the freezing water soaking into his socks, but his focus was locked on the ground. There, illuminated by the flickering light of a failing street lamp, was a set of prints that defied the heavyset tread of the local police. They were light, ball-of-the-foot impressions that barely disturbed the mud, spaced with the terrifyingly long stride of someone capable of leaping great distances. He followed the trail deeper into the labyrinth of the old district, where the buildings leaned toward each other like conspirators, and the smell of wet brick and stagnant drains filled his lungs. Every instinct he had honed over 15 years told him he was closing the gap, his hand resting on the grip of the pulse stunner tucked into the small of his back. The alley terminated abruptly against a towering reinforced concrete wall, a dead end choked with rusted canisters and discarded crates. Tobias slowed his pace, his breath hitching in his throat as he saw a silhouette perched atop a stack of shipping pallets. The figure was draped in a dark, saturated cloak that clung to a frame far too small for the havoc it had caused. Tobias drew his weapon, the power cell whining as it cycled to life with a pale blue glow that cut through the gloom. "State security, drop the drive and keep your hands where I can see them," he commanded, his voice projecting a gravelly authority that masked the tremor in his fingers. The thief didn't move at first, staying coiled like a spring, the heavy rain sheeting off the hood of the cloak. Tobias stepped forward, the mud squelching beneath his soles, narrowing the distance until the barrel of his stunner was leveled directly at the center of the figure's chest. "You have nowhere left to run," he added, his heart hammering against his ribs with a rhythm that felt like a warning. Slowly, with a grace that made the metal pallets beneath her remain silent, the figure stood. A gloved hand reached up, the silk damp and clinging, and pulled back the heavy hood. The breath left Tobias's body in a sharp, painful hiss. It was Kaya. Her dark hair was plastered to her forehead, but her velvet ears were swept back flat against her skull, twitching as they caught the sound of his ragged breathing. Her amber eyes, usually so warm and inviting over a cup of tea, were wide with a primal, raw terror that made her vertical pupils narrow into razor-thin slits. She didn't look like a master spy. She looked like a cornered animal waiting for the final blow. Tobias felt the weight of the stunner become a leaden anchor in his hand, his vision blurring for a split second as his reality fractured. The woman he had begun to trust, the only person who made the gray world of espionage feel vibrant, was the ghost he had been ordered to eliminate. "Tobias, please," she whispered, her voice cracking as it competed with the rhythmic drumming of the rain. Her tail, thick and dark, uncoiled from her waist and lashed once against the air, a sign of extreme agitation she could no longer hide. He didn't lower the weapon, though his aim wavered by a fraction of an inch. "You were at the club," he accused, his mind struggling to piece together the timeline. "You sat across from me while your team hit the data hub. You used me as a distraction." Kaya shook her head frantically, a stray droplet of water flying from the tuft of her ear. "I'm not working for a team, and I am not a traitor to your people," she insisted, taking a small, tentative step toward him. "I am a refugee, Tobias. The drive I took contains the architectural maps of the detention blocks where my kin are being held. Your ministry didn't just intercept cables, they stole the heritage and the locations of my remaining family. I am not selling secrets to the highest bidder, I am trying to find a way home." The revelation hit him with the force of a physical blow, forcing him to reevaluate every file he had read and every briefing Charles had given him. The state called it counterintelligence, but if Kaya was telling the truth, he was merely the guard dog for a horde of stolen lives. He looked at her, seeing the way she shivered not from the cold, but from the sheer weight of her desperation. His thumb hovered over the safety switch of the stunner. If he brought her in, Sloane would have her in a pressurized interrogation cell within the hour, and feline hybrids rarely survive the aggressive chemical questioning the agency employed. Yet, if he let her go, he was violating the oath that had defined his entire adult life. He was a man of the law, a pillar of the security grid, and here he was, staring into the eyes of a woman who represented everything he was supposed to hate, feeling nothing but a crushing sense of empathy. The silence of the alley was brutally interrupted by the crackle of the radio clipped to his shoulder. "Tobias, what is your status?" The voice was Sloane's, cold and devoid of any human inflection, sounding like sharpened steel scraping against stone. "We have a visual on a high-speed exit from the hub area, but the perimeter teams lost the signal in the north sector." "Did you intercept the target?" Tobias froze, his gaze locked on Kaya. She was watching the radio as if it were a venomous snake, her claws extending instinctively from the tips of her gloves, glinting like polished obsidian in the blue light of his weapon. He knew Sloane. The woman was a relentless hunter who viewed the world in binaries of assets and threats. If he gave Kaya up now, there would be no trial, no mercy, only a quiet disappearance into the agency's black site. He looked back at Kaya, searching for any sign of the manipulation he had feared. Instead, he saw the small, rhythmic pulse in her neck and the way she held her breath, waiting for him to seal her fate. The internal conflict was a physical ache, a tearing sensation in his chest that made it hard to stand straight. He thought of the quiet nights in the diner, the way she listened to him talk about his weariness, and the genuine warmth he had felt in her presence. Was it all an act? Or was she, like him, just a soul caught in the gears of a machine that didn't care who it crushed? His finger tightened on the trigger, the hum of the power cell vibrating through his palm, a reminder of the lethal force he held over her. "Tobias, respond immediately," Sloane barked, her voice rising in pitch, signaling her growing impatience. "We are moving to your last known coordinates. If you have the target pinned, hold for backup." He didn't look away from Kaya's amber eyes. He saw the flicker of a tear trailing down her cheek, lost almost instantly in the deluge of the rain. In that moment, the agency felt like a cold, distant ghost, while the woman in front of him was the only thing that felt real. He reached up with his free hand and keyed the mic, his voice steady despite the chaos screaming in his mind. "I lost the trail in the flooded tunnels, Sloane," he lied, the words feeling like a heavy stone dropping into a deep well. "The signal must have been a ghost. I'm heading back to the jazz club to re-examine the point of entry. Clear the sector." He cut the connection before she could respond, the silence that followed feeling heavier than the storm. The air in the alleyway seemed to solidify as the weight of the deception settled over Tobias, his heart thumping a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Kaya remained frozen on the crates, her amber eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and guarded hope. He lowered the stunner, the blue glow fading into a dull gray as the power cell cycled down, though he kept his grip tight on the handle. "You have exactly 5 minutes before Sloane realizes my GPS hasn't moved toward the club," Tobias said, his voice a low rasp that barely carried over the splashing of the rain. "If you are lying to me about those files, Kaya, I will be the one who finds you next time, and there will be no radio silence." She didn't waste time with gratitude or empty promises. She simply beckoned him forward with a sharp jerk of her head. "Follow me," she urged, her voice tight with urgency as she leaped from the pallets with a fluid, silent grace that no human could ever hope to replicate. They moved through the skeletal remains of the old city, a district of hollowed-out tenements and crumbling brickwork that the modern government had long since abandoned to the moss and the shadows. Kaya navigated the ruins with an uncanny spatial awareness, slipping through jagged gaps in rusted fences and scaling collapsed stairwells, as if gravity were merely a suggestion. Tobias struggled to keep pace, his heavy boots clattering against the debris, his breath coming in ragged bursts that clouded in the freezing air. Eventually, she led him through a concealed crawlspace behind a rotted tapestry of ivy, emerging into the cavernous belly of an ancient subway station. The space was illuminated by the soft, flickering orange glow of several small cookstoves. Dozens of figures moved in the dim light, all possessing the same tufted ears, long tails, and wary, feline gazes as Kaya. They were huddled in family groups, their meager belongings piled on tattered blankets, hiding in the very bowels of the city Tobias was sworn to protect. A tall, lean male with a jagged scar across his muzzle stepped forward, his hand resting on the hilt of a rusted blade, but Kaya placed herself firmly between him and Tobias. "He is with me, Ren," she stated. Her tone brooked no argument as she guided Tobias toward a makeshift ladder leading upward. They climbed past the subterranean camp, ascending through a ventilation shaft until they emerged onto a high-rise balcony that clung precariously to the side of a derelict skyscraper. The rain had slowed to a fine, misty drizzle, and the city stretched out below them like a carpet of shattered diamonds and neon veins. From this height, the harshness of the urban sprawl softened into something almost beautiful, a sprawling map of light and shadow. Kaya walked to the edge of the rusted railing, her tail twitching rhythmically as she looked out over the horizon. "This is why we stay," she whispered, her gaze fixed on the distant silhouette of the mountains. "We are not a virus in your system. We are the remnants of a culture that existed long before your ministry drew its first border." Tobias stood a few paces behind her, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his trench coat to hide their trembling. He looked at the way the moonlight caught the velvet texture of her ears, a detail he had once thought was a clever prosthetic or a trick of the light. The realization that he had spent his career hunting people who were simply trying to survive felt like a slow-acting poison in his veins. "Why didn't Charles tell me about the camps?" he asked, the name of his superior officer tasting like ash in his mouth. "My briefing said your kind were insurgent cells from the outer territories, sent here to destabilize the currency." Kaya turned to face him, a bitter smile touching her lips as she reached into a hidden pocket of her dress and pulled out a slim, silver data drive. "Charles knows exactly what we are," she replied, holding the drive out toward him. "He is the one who signed the relocation orders for the southern sector. He doesn't want you to see us as people because it is much harder to arrest a person than it is to neutralize a threat." He took the drive from her, the metal cold against his skin, and slotted it into the portable reader built into his forearm display. As the holographic files flickered into existence, Tobias felt the world tilt on its axis. These weren't weapon schematics or encryption codes for the National Treasury. They were manifests. Page after page of names, ages, and biological markers, all cross-referenced with geographic coordinates for high-security facilities hidden in the industrial wastes. He saw photos of children with tufted ears being loaded into unmarked transport trucks and thermal scans of overcrowded barracks that looked more like cages than housing. The 3 terabytes of data he had been sent to recover were a ledger of human rights violations, a confession of a shadow war being fought in the dark corners of his own government. Charles hadn't been protecting the state from a ghost. He had been protecting himself from the truth. The weight of the betrayal settled in his gut like a lead weight, making the air feel thin and brittle. He looked at the data, then back at Kaya, who was watching him with a heartbreaking vulnerability. She wasn't a spy who had infiltrated his life. She was a desperate woman who had reached out to the only person she thought might still have a shred of humanity left. "I thought I was the one doing the right thing," Tobias muttered, his voice barely a whisper as he deactivated the display. I thought the law was the only thing standing between us and total collapse. Kaya stepped closer, the scent of rain and dried lavender clinging to her, and placed a gloved hand on his chest, right over his hammering heart. The law is just a set of rules written by the people who already have everything, she said softly, her amber eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made his breath hitch. Justice is something else entirely. It is what we do when the rules tell us to look away from suffering. Tobias felt the heat of her palm through the layers of his shirt and coat, a grounding presence in a world that had suddenly become unrecognizable. He had spent his life following orders, believing that the structure of the agency provided a moral compass he could rely on. Now, looking at the evidence of Charles's cruelty and the quiet dignity of the people hiding in the ruins below, that compass was spinning wildly. He wasn't just a counterintelligence agent anymore. He was a witness to a crime that his own hands had helped facilitate. The trust that had been simmering between him and Kaya over those late-night coffees hadn't been a fabrication or a trap. It had been the bridge they both needed to cross the divide between their species. He realized then that they were both fighting for the same thing, a version of justice that the ministry had tried to bury under layers of bureaucracy and fear. A sudden flash of red and blue light swept across the face of the building from the street level far below, followed by the distant, rhythmic thumping of a tactical rotorcraft. Sloane hadn't been fooled by his lie for long. She was sweeping the sector with thermal scanners, and it was only a matter of minutes before the signatures of the beast folk in the ruins were picked up by the agency's sensors. Tobias looked at Kaya, seeing the flash of terror return to her eyes as she heard the approaching engines. He didn't have much time to make a choice that would define the rest of his life. If he stayed with her, he was a traitor to the only home he had ever known. If he left, he was a monster. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers, feeling the slight pressure of her claws through the silk of her glove. "We need to move," he said, his voice firm and filled with a new, dangerous resolve. "If they find this place, they'll destroy everything. I know how the agency thinks, and I know how to get your people out of the city." Kaya squeezed his hand, her vertical pupils widening as she searched his face for any hint of hesitation. "You would give up everything for us?" she asked, her voice trembling with the magnitude of the sacrifice. Tobias looked down at the silver drive in his hand, the key to exposing the rot at the heart of his world, and then back at the woman who had shown him the truth. "I'm not giving up everything, Kaya," he replied, a grim smile touching his lips as the first searchlight swept across the balcony. "I'm finally finding something worth keeping." The roar of the helicopter grew louder, the wind from its blades whipping his trench coat around his legs, but he didn't pull away. They stood together on the edge of the abyss, two enemies turned allies by a truth that neither of them could ignore, ready to face the storm that was about to break over their heads. The sharp glare of a tactical floodlight sliced through the mist, pinning Tobias and Kaya against the rusted brickwork of the balcony. Below them, the muffled thud of armored boots echoed as Sloane's extraction team breached the ground floor. Tobias felt a vibration in his pocket. His discarded comms unit was screaming with an override signal. Sloane had tracked the unique signature of his internal biometric chip, the one he had forgotten to mask in his haste. He looked down into the courtyard to see a dozen figures in matte black ceramic plating fanning out with surgical precision. They weren't here for a conversation. They were moving in a pincer formation designed to liquidate a target. Kaya's ears flattened against her skull, and her tail lashed with a violent, rhythmic anxiety. "They found us because of me," Tobias realized, the guilt hitting him like a physical blow to the solar plexus. He gripped her hand tighter, feeling the slight tremor in her slender frame. The heavy steel door leading to the roof groaned and then buckled under the force of a thermal charge. Instead of Sloane, a man in a crisp, pinstriped suit stepped through the billowing smoke, his polished shoes looking absurdly out of place amidst the grime of the ruins. Charles stood there, flanked by two guards, his expression one of disappointed paternalism rather than anger. He adjusted his silk tie and looked at Tobias with a cold, calculating pity. "You are always too sentimental for this line of work, Tobias," Charles said, his voice smooth and devoid of any tremor. "I sent you to retrieve a leak, not to join the plumbing." He gestured toward Kaya with a flick of his wrist, as if she were a piece of stray lint. "This conflict is necessary for the next phase of the urban expansion project, and your little discovery was never meant to leave this building." The realization dawned on Tobias that Charles had orchestrated the leak himself to identify dissenters within the ministry and provide a pretext for the final sweep of the subterranean camps. The high-pitched whine of a surveillance drone signaled the end of the standoff. Charles signaled his men to advance, but Kaya didn't wait for the first shot. She lunged toward the industrial crane arm overhanging the alley, her movements a blur of feline grace and desperation. Tobias followed, his heart hammering against his ribs as he leaped across the 4-foot gap to the swaying metal beam. They scrambled over the jagged skyline of the old district, the wind howling through the gaps in their clothing as bullets chipped the masonry behind them. Drones buzzed overhead like angry hornets, their red targeting lasers dancing across Tobias's back. He could see Sloane on a neighboring roof, her sniper rifle leveled at them, her face a mask of professional detachment. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to stay low, but Kaya was already halfway across a narrow glass skybridge, her silhouette a flickering shadow against the neon glow of the lower city. Near the edge of the district, the bridge gave way under the weight of a well-placed explosive round from a drone. Kaya stumbled, her footing lost as the glass shattered into 1,000 glittering diamonds. She caught the edge of a protruding girder, her body dangling hundreds of feet above the concrete. Tobias reached for her, his fingers brushing the silk of her glove, but the metal was slick with oil and rain. "Go, Tobias," she gasped, her amber eyes wide with a terrifying clarity. "Take the drive to the central hub. If they catch us both, the truth dies here." She began to loosen her grip, clearly intending to drop into the darkness to draw the pursuit away from him. He saw the logic in her eyes, the cold math of a martyr, and it sickened him. He didn't care about the mission or the agency anymore. He cared about the warmth of her hand in his. Instead of running, Tobias unbuckled his tactical belt and threw his silver agency badge into the abyss, watching it vanish into the fog. He threw himself flat onto the girder, locking his legs around a support strut, and grabbed Kaya's wrist with both hands. "I'm not leaving you behind," he roared over the scream of the wind. He hauled her up with a burst of adrenaline-fueled strength, pulling her chest to chest against him on the narrow ledge. They were cornered, with Sloane's squad closing in from the roof and a transport ship hovering just yards away. Tobias stood up, shielding Kaya with his own body, and held the data drive high in the air where the drone cameras could see it. He knew the internal protocols better than anyone. The moment a high-level agent went rogue with sensitive data, the feed was automatically archived to the central mainframe. He wasn't just standing his ground. He was ensuring the evidence was being recorded by the very system meant to suppress it. The transition to the interrogation room was a blur of zip ties and rough handling. Now, Tobias sat bolted to a metal chair, the harsh light of a single overhead lamp burning into his retinas. Sloane stood in the shadows, her arms crossed, while Charles paced the perimeter of the small, concrete box. "You have committed high treason, Tobias," Charles whispered, leaning down until his breath smelled of expensive coffee and stale mints. "Give me the encryption key for the drive's secondary partition, and I might let the girl live in a labor camp instead of a furnace." Tobias looked up, a slow, bloody smile spreading across his face. He had spent the last hour in the transport van using his neural link to bypass the ministry's firewalls. "I didn't just record the data, Charles," he said, his voice raspy but triumphant. "I set a timer. Every screen in this city, from the billboards in the plaza to the tablets in the schools, is about to see your signature on those relocation orders." The silence that followed was broken by a distant, muffled roar from the streets below. It wasn't a bomb. It was the sound of thousands of voices rising in a collective wave of shock and fury. On the wall monitor in the interrogation room, the feed flickered to life, showing the horrific images of the southern sector camps being broadcast to the entire population. The public facade of the ministry crumbled in real time. Charles's face drained of color as his own personal comms unit began to chime incessantly with alerts from the High Council. The door burst open, but it wasn't more guards. It was a pair of internal affairs officers, their expressions grim as they moved past a stunned Sloan to place Charles in handcuffs. The corruption had been exposed so completely that the government had no choice but to cut the rod out to save itself. Weeks later, the city felt like a different world. The rain still fell, but the shadows seemed less oppressive. Tobias sat on the edge of the balcony where it had all begun, his trench coat draped over his shoulders. Kaya sat beside him, her tail resting peacefully across his lap, no longer coiled in a defensive knot. The High Council had issued an emergency decree granting the beast folk legal residency and protection, and the camps were being dismantled. Tobias was no longer an agent, and Kaya was no longer a ghost. They watched the sun begin to bleed over the horizon, painting the clouds in shades of soft gold and violet. There was a long road ahead to rebuild what had been broken, but as Kaya leaned her head against his shoulder, Tobias knew he had made the right choice. They were no longer defined by the secrets they kept, but by the life they were finally free to lead together in the light.